We are very happy and grateful and full of admiration that you have braved the cold weather to come out into the 19th district and that you have made a choice to participate in an interesting discussion instead of watching Morocco, France in the World Championship. So welcome, we are very glad that you are here. I don't have really to introduce Professor Jeffrey Sachs to you. I mean, he's very well known, so just a few words. He's an American economist, academic, public policy analyst, university professor at Columbia University, and we will focus today on American foreign policy and the consequences of possible changes that came out as a result of the midterm elections. But the main focus of the work that Professor Sachs has been doing during the last years was a little bit different. He was mainly concentrating on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, of course, a foreign policy subject of the highest order, but is, of course, with a different angle and a different perspective. Professor Sachs was special advisor to 3 Secretary-Generals, to Kofi Annan, to Ban Ki-moon, and also now to António Guterres. And he's also the founder and the chief strategist of the so-called Millennium Promise Alliance, a non-profit organization which is dedicated to ending extreme poverty. He is also a co-editor of the World Happiness Report, and that's something that, given the status the world is in, a World Happiness Report, I think, is what we all need for. Today, we will focus on US foreign policy, as I have already said, against the backdrop of the midterm elections, the backdrop of the Biden administration, and also against the backdrop of Professor Sachs' recent book, A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. Professor Sachs will introduce his ideas in 15-20 minutes, and then we will have a brief discussion among ourselves, and then we will turn to the floor and give you the opportunity for questions and answers. I'm sure we will have a very interesting discussion. Professor Sachs, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be together with all of you, and a great opportunity to talk about our difficult situation in the world. Where does one begin with American foreign policy? It's very troubled. It creates a lot of problems. I think for as long as I remember, and this now is quite several decades, at least for 55 years of my political memory, the US has been at war, almost nonstop. And this goes with the territory, and we're at war again, because the war in Ukraine is a US war with Russia, in which Ukraine is the territory. Ukrainians are dying, Americans are fighting, funding, and defining the war aims. So this goes back a long time. My political life began marching on the streets of Detroit, Michigan against the Vietnam War. My political awareness began with the Pentagon Papers, which explained that American leaders lied repeatedly about the war, mainly to get to the next election. And Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, wrote a wonderful essay in 1970, which has stuck with me for 52 years, where he said the quagmire myth and the stalemate machine. And he was trying to explain why the US was stuck in Vietnam. And he said that the usual expression is, we walked into a quagmire. And he said that is not the right model. The right model is what he called the stalemate machine, which is never admit defeat before the next election. But since there's always a next election, you never have the opportunity to admit defeat. It was only with Richard Nixon's impeachment that actually Gerald Ford was able to end the war in Vietnam. Otherwise, it would probably have gone on for another 50 years if it had been continuous presidential administrations. We specialize in perpetual war for two reasons. One, the wars are almost always a mistake because they are an attempt to address political issues through military means in a completely flawed way. And then once in, they can't be stopped, almost without exception, or at least until 15 or 20 years has led to exhaustion. So we were in Afghanistan for 20 full years, from 2001 to 2021. Biden used his first year to pull out of Afghanistan. I thought maybe there would be a year of peace, but that was a little naive on my part, because instead of negotiating with Putin at the end of 2021 over very pertinent issues like the enlargement of NATO to Ukraine, which is the main casus belli of this war, Biden said, I will not negotiate, and so we find ourselves back at war once again. I find all of this deeply disturbing, but am extraordinarily worried that we are about to enter more war in Asia, because we are actually in two fronts now. One is the war in Ukraine, which continues to threaten to expand because, again, the model now is never allow defeat. If anything is on that path, escalate, which is not good when it's two nuclear superpowers. That's a pretty dangerous logic, but that is the prevailing logic. And if you criticize it, you're called a Putin apologist, which I am not, I want to say right at the beginning. I am nobody's apologist. I just don't like perpetual wars and think that we ought to use other means to resolve these issues. But the United States doctrine, unfortunately, is now rather explicit, and that is that to be secure, the U.S. must be the predominant power in each region of the world. So I liken it to a game that I played when I was young called Risk, which is a board game where the aim of the game is to have your piece on every part of the world map. And if you have your pieces on all but a few parts of the map, those places where you don't control could win back the territory that you have. So you're trying to have every piece on the board. Well, the United States has military bases in 80 countries around the world, but alas for the United States, there are 193 countries, so there's a lot of wars to go. Because every place where we have a base, but there isn't a base next door, Americans feel a threat, or we're told to feel a threat. And moreover, of course, and the deeper point is, China is now perceived by the United States as an existential threat to American primacy, because American policymakers cannot understand how we made the mistake of letting China become a powerful country. This was not in the playbook. China was supposed to develop in a way that is subservient to the United States. And so now we call it a failure that we made various mistakes, like letting China in the World Trade Organization, or letting China play institutionally. This is obviously a mistake, not in my view because China did anything wrong, and as a development economist, and I think a pretty good one and a pretty knowledgeable one, I would tell you that China has managed economic development better than just about any place in world history, with a lot of skill and a tremendously high saving rate and a tremendous determination to catch up from a century of impoverishment, and they've done it quite brilliantly, in fact. But in the US view, they cheated, and now they have to be punished for threatening American security. So every day you read stories about how the US is cutting off technology to China, telling all of us, don't you dare buy a Huawei phone, don't you dare use Chinese technology. Every day new companies are listed on the so-called entity list, which is the American enemies list of foreign enterprises. And all of this is to say briefly that we're threatening a second front of war right now. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an exemplar of complete irresponsibility, complete provocation, complete disrespect to another major power, complete abnegation of the one China policy after we had been asked repeatedly, do not go right now. And it's like, in my view, although I have to tell you, everybody hates me for saying it in the United States. I just got more hate mail before I walked on the stage. It's the same kind of provocations that led to the war in Ukraine. We'll talk about that. I'm supposed to say that this is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th because Putin is an irrational madman who thinks he's Peter the Great. That is the official line. This is not how the war started. This is not the background to the conflict. This is not an understanding, nor is it an approach that could possibly end this war safely. This war started when the United States decided it would move NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. And if you look on a map, the idea quite explicitly laid out by Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom I knew, and who really did not like Russia as a true Polish patriot, was that we could have NATO in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, thereby surrounding Russia in the Black Sea, in Sevastopol. And this is, to my mind, just the second Crimean War, because that was the idea of Palmerston and Napoleon III, and we're at it again. Boris Johnson fantasized that he was Palmerston. I don't know what the Americans think, but in any event, I'm worried about a two-front war that continues to spread because right now, one is not allowed to say one word of what I've just told you in the mainstream US media, to have this debate, to discuss the origins of the crisis, to say anything other than we fully support Ukraine, which to my mind means loving them to death, to their death. And I warned the Ukrainians that at the start of this, that they would become the Afghanistan of Europe. And by that I meant years and years of destruction, all in a patriotic call to battle, as opposed to a clear statement that the US will not expand NATO to Ukraine and Russia should get out and we should leave a space between the two superpowers and keep things safe. I regard, by the way, and I'll stop here, Austria's State Treaty of 1955 as one of the great successes of diplomacy of modern history, a demonstration of how actually to make peace with a belligerent counterpart, something that has made this country remarkably successful. And I wish the lesson were understood for Ukraine, because Ukraine could have learned from Austria. Instead, Austria is often told, stop your neutrality. Please don't do that. we should really understand that a bit of mutual prudence, a bit of regard for another superpower can go a long way to preventing war, but not if you're aiming to put your piece on every spot of the map. So I'll stop there. As you can tell, I'm not enamored of US foreign policy right now, but I can tell you my views are decidedly in a minority in the United States and not quite acceptable for polite company. So I apologize if I've been impolite. Thank you.
Well, I don't think that you have been impolite, but you have, of course, raised a number of very pertinent questions and also some very controversial questions. I mean, to take them one by one, yeah, because there were quite a number of them. I mean, you started out by saying that the deplorable situation that we have in the Ukraine is an American war, yeah? But at the same time, you can say it's also a European war, because we have been also a victim of a very, should say, provocative Russian stance and Russian behavior for decades now, you know, with cyber attacks, with trying to infringe on the European Union, support Brexit, support the extreme right in various European countries. I mean, all that, apart from killings and I mean, really attacks on Russian citizens abroad. I mean, there has been a very provocative behavior which finally culminated in the military aggression against Ukraine. And that, of course, if you see it now also from a European perspective, was a kind of a farewell to everything that Europe has been building up over the last 50, 60 years, and everything that we have believed in, you know, civilized behavior, respect of borders, no military conflicts, and so forth. So in a way, this is a situation which touches not only on American interests, it touches very deeply on European interests, because if it should, Cambodia is at the moment not very likely, but if it should turn out that Ukraine will really succumb, then the consequences for Europe as a whole might be very, very troublesome. So do you see the European connection here as well?
For me, let me just elaborate a little bit of my understanding of this, because it goes back, for me personally, 32 years. I was Poland's main economic advisor in the first 2 years of the transformation and helped Poland make a lot of needed changes and helped cancel Poland's debts and helped stabilize their currency, and was very, very deeply involved in the transformation. And in that period, the person who played the most constructive role in the entire world by far was Mikhail Gorbachev. He enabled the Polish democratization. He enabled the Polish reforms. He helped other countries in the neighborhood to make the democratic transformation. He was a really most remarkable man and basically believed in peace. And he believed in Europe and, of course, talked about the European common home. In 1990, when he initiated the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact, because this started with Gorbachev, dismantling the Warsaw Pact military alliance, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker said to him, we will not take advantage of dismantling the Warsaw Pact by moving NATO 1 inch eastward. And this was not only a statement, this was thoroughly discussed and vetted with a tremendous amount of archival material to explain all of the discussions and negotiations about non-NATO enlargement. And to my mind, that's the starting point for understanding what has gone wrong, because we cheated. And the United States was the cheating party, because in 1992, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, who were in the Defense Department of the US, said, we are now the sole superpower of the world. Now we do what we want. I was briefly Gorbachev's, an advisor to Gorbachev's economic team, and tried to raise Western financial help to stabilize a profoundly unstable, collapsing situation in the Soviet Union, and the White House said no. And then I was asked by President Yeltsin to help him. My main job was get some Western money for us, because the situation is a financial freefall. So I worked with Yegor Gaidar, who was both the finance minister and deputy prime minister in 1992. And the White House said no to every single recommendation that I made. And it was explained to me that even though the recommendations I was making were the same ones that had worked successfully to stabilize Poland, the US would never help Russia in that way. So to my mind, Gorbachev's dream ended with Gorbachev. Yeltsin wanted completely normal relations. He wanted peace. He put his trust first in Bush, then he put his trust in Clinton. Clinton in 1994 sold him a bill of goods. We won't expand NATO, we'll have a partnership agreement, which Yeltsin loved, because the partnership agreement for NATO was that every former Soviet satellite in Central and Eastern Europe would be part of a NATO partnership, but none would be given preference over others. It would really be a new joint relationship. There was a bitter debate inside the Clinton administration between Madeleine Albright, who was a hardliner, Czech hardliner, wanted to stick it to Russia. Zbig Brzezinski, of course, absolutely hardliner, and Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense, who said, do not enlarge NATO. We're just starting to build trust with our Russian counterparts. If you do this, this will be extraordinarily damaging. Albright won the debate. Clinton cheated, in my opinion, went ahead with the NATO enlargement. Yeltsin was apoplectic, very, very unhappy, but he was extremely weak, of course, very vulnerable and very weak. Bill Perry, incidentally, thought about resigning in protest, decided not to. Then in his memoirs, written 20 years later, wondered again, should he have resigned? And our greatest statesman scholar of the second half of the 20th century, George Kennan, who was a brilliant man, said, this is a disaster. This is the road to the new Cold War. In 1999, we bombed Belgrade 41 days in a row. We destroyed the infrastructure, we destroyed the electricity, we destroyed the water. That's Bill Clinton, I remind you. No one said war crimes at the time, did they? No. But we said we would break up Serbia to give independence to Kosovo. The Russians were apoplectic again. That's our ally. You're bombing them in the middle of Europe. How many times have you heard per day that this is the first European war since 1945? That's a lie. 1999 war on Serbia, a NATO war, by the way. Not even just a US war, that was NATO bombing of Serbia for 41 consecutive days. Then 9/11 happened. Putin said, we will support you, even support your war in Afghanistan at the beginning. And then Iraq. And Putin was again, are you kidding? You're going to go to war in Iraq? And of course, Russia was completely pushed aside. And that was an ally of Russia, Saddam Hussein. And it was a war on completely phony charges. And by the way, not mistaken charges, phony charges. You could tell it a mile away, by the way. But I remember I was on a talk show. What's his name? Charlie Rose. So, like usual, there were 6 people around the table, all of them saying, war, 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 Saddam, he's Hitler, war, 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 weapons of mass destruction. And it came to me, because this was the day that Colin Powell was in the UN Security Council, and I said, I'm against this war. Mr. Sachs, are you calling General Powell a liar? And the camera was frozen on me, and I said, well, I suppose I am. I don't believe that. It's pretty clear that this is how you talk when you don't really have the goods. Turned out to be that way. 10 years later, everybody knew it at the time. Well, in fact, everybody was in favor of war at the time. It was not pleasant. So that was 2003. Then in 2007, 7 NATO enlargements. And think of them. Bulgaria and Romania and the Black Sea, the 3 Baltic countries, Slovenia and Slovakia. That's a heavy dose for Russia. But then in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, Bush, over the strenuous objections of all European leaders who knew that this was a terrible idea, pushed for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. And European leaders, being European, they don't speak in public against the United States. So they negotiated. They said, okay, no roadmap, no partnership agreement, but the final declaration will say that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, which is what the 2008 Bucharest summit communique says. The next day was the NATO-Russia summit, because we still had those meetings then. And Putin said to Bush, if you move on NATO enlargement, we will take back Crimea. This was 2008, 14 years ago. Because Crimea is our naval base and has been since 1783, thank you. So in 2010, Yanukovych became president of Ukraine, which was very fortunate for Ukraine, because Yanukovych understood that he was in a delicate balancing act. And so he had Europe and the US on one side, he had Russia on the other side, and the first thing he said is, we need to stay neutral. And so he pushed neutrality through the Ukrainian parliament, and he negotiated a long-term lease arrangement for Sevastopol, that Russia would have its naval base rights until 2041, with the potential of extension after that. Well, Europe pushed very hard for the accession agreement, and the United States pushed very hard to topple Yanukovych. And in the Maidan, though we don't really know all the things that historians someday will know, we do know how active the United States was in stoking the insurrection. And interestingly for me, I was asked by the Ukrainian prime minister who came to office the next day, Mr. Yatsenuk, to fly to Kiev to meet with him to talk about the economic situation, which I did. And when I arrived in Kiev, I was shown around by a leading American NGO that described to me all the money that they had put into this successful overthrow. So I saw and heard with my own eyes the American involvement in the overthrow of a pro-Russian government. That's pretty provocative. Europe negotiated the evening in February 2014 that Yanukovych would stay in power and that there would be elections late in 2014. There was gunfight from the Ukrainian nationalist side because careful scholars have shown that the bullets that killed the policemen and the bullets that killed the protesters were from the same guns from the hotels controlled by the insurrectionists. And Yanukovych fled, and Europe immediately said the next day, okay, we recognize the new government. Because Victoria Nuland, you remember, who loved Europe so much in that taped phone call, I don't know if you remember her French, but I'm sure you do, that was the American policy. So the pro-Russian government was overthrown. A quite radical Russophobic government was brought in extra-constitutionally in violation of the Ukrainian constitution. The US and Europe immediately recognized that government. Putin seized Crimea, and the separatists backed by Russia declared independence of Lugansk and Donetsk. Then came Mrs. Merkel, and we've just heard a lot from her in the last week, because she said we need to negotiate a diplomatic approach called the Minsk II Agreement. Now, I know firsthand, as we all really do, but I know firsthand, that the Ukrainians never intended to implement the Minsk II Agreement. Mrs. Merkel said last week that she didn't either. I actually don't believe that, by the way. I think she thinks that's a good thing to say now. I think at the time she wanted to implement it. Maybe not. But in any event, the bad faith was astounding because France and Germany were supposed to be the guarantors of the Minsk II process. The Ukrainians said, no way, we're not doing this. We signed it, but we're not doing it. In the meantime, the United States flooded Ukraine with billions of dollars of weaponry, training, NATO interoperability, and that brought us to 2021. So the war started in 2014 in February with the violent overthrow of a government, which we backed. And we started the war. I mean, we started to massively fund Ukraine, which is why they were able to fight this year, just as Merkel said. She said, yes, 7 years. It was a massive military buildup. And then in 2021, President Putin said to the new president of the United States, Joe Biden, stop the NATO enlargement. This has gone too far. I called the White House at the end of 2021, begging them, avoid the war, stop this. I was told, oh, don't worry about it, NATO's not going to enlarge Ukraine. I said, great, why don't you say so publicly? Oh no, we would never say so publicly. said, well, then you're likely to have a war. Yeah, no, but no, never, Ukraine's never going to be part of NATO. Well, say so publicly and we can avoid a war. And by the way, help the world to understand, if Putin still launches a war, that it's not about NATO. But you know what? It is about NATO. That's been the plan all along. It is, of course, it's about NATO. It's about NATO, it's about Crimea, it's about what Brzezinski wrote in 1997, that the control over Ukraine would render Russia without any power, corner Russia, basically in the back of Eurasia. That's what it's about. So I don't see Europe's wisdom in this, frankly. I just see us having walked into a trap. I see Europe as the big loser of this, by the way. I see Europe as the huge loser of this. I don't know why, when the US blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, that we're all silent about it.
Yeah. And I still.
Why are we silent about it?
What's your proof?
Pardon me?
What is your proof?
That President Biden said on February 7th of this year that if Russia invades, the pipeline is finished. And the reporter looked incredulously, said, Mr. President, that is Russian, German infrastructure. And President Biden says, don't worry, we have our ways. And the US does have its ways. It controls that territory. It monitors that territory. After the pipeline was blown up, our Secretary of State said, and I'm quoting, "This is a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe from Russian energy." What a weird statement if you're worried about international piracy of global infrastructure. You would say it's a terrible crime, it's a threat to world peace. You would not call it a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe from Russian energy. This was part of American foreign policy. Now, the Swedes went in to clean up the debris. And what did the Swedes say? We cannot share our findings with Germany because of national security. Can you figure that one out? I can. But it's incredible. How could Sweden not share its findings with Germany and Denmark? But their job was to clean up the debris so that nobody else could investigate either. And they've done that. Now, the press, in this most remarkable act of vandalism on a key piece of international infrastructure, has not said a word in 8 weeks. Why? It's unimportant? Not one reporter is curious? When I spoke to a leading reporter of one of our leading papers, a paper that says every day that Russia did it, most likely, and I said to this leading reporter, whom I've known for 40 years, I think the US did it. He said, of course the US did it. I said, well, why doesn't your paper say so? And he said, well, you know, the editors, we don't really have the proof, but yeah, of course, who else would have done it? That's what he said. And then I showed him, but your paper said today that senior US officials point to Russia as the likely agent of this destruction. Yeah, Jeff, you know, it's hard, it's complicated. I said, when I was young, I used to read your newspaper because you went after Nixon and Watergate and because you published the Pentagon Papers and so forth. He said, yes, but that paper is dead. So I think Europe is in a trap. And the question for Europe, in my opinion, truly, is your job to support American hegemonic aspirations, or is it to protect European security? Because these are not the same thing. They're really not the same thing. I love Europe too much to think that they are the same thing.
Well, it was a terrific historic overview, which has brought us a little bit away from our original subject. I've lived through that period in a previous function as foreign policy advisor to Chancellor Vranitzky, and I remember those years, 89, 90, 91, very, very well. And one thing we should not overlook in the debate is that for those countries that emerged from communist rule and from the Warsaw Pact, from Soviet dominance, joining the EU was one objective, but joining NATO as quickly as possible was their main security objective, which they pursued with determination. And so we cannot only see that as sort of a US-Russia, US-Soviet Union political affair. There were many other interests involved and many other actors putting pressure and making influence and so on. And we all agree, I think, that of course with a different European policy, many mistakes probably could have been avoided at the time. We see that now in retrospect, yeah? That perhaps Europe would have been well advised to be more open to Gorbachev's advances and not at that time be totally inward-looking, enlargement, and what do we do, and Treaty of Nice, and transition to the European Union, and making the euro, and so on. That was also concentration was somewhere else, yeah, and the Gorbachev dream of the Russian house. I remember the 1990 conference in Paris, yeah, where there was still this bit of hope that there might be something different coming out of it, but that chance was missed. But I would nevertheless say that we should give a little bit or concentrate a little bit on what is happening now. Yeah. You were very pessimistic with sort of what regards the developments in Asia and the relationship to China. Now, I'm not as pessimistic as you are, because I think there are different signs, and I have the feeling that the Biden administration is really trying to walk a very narrow path here, yeah? Between, on the one side, being tough, and on the other side, keeping channels of communication open. And we have just learned that a big delegation is going to China to prepare for a meeting Biden-Xi Jinping. Of course, the question is superpower, perhaps declining superpower on the rise. Former President Hu was being escorted out of the room at the last party conference, before this has said in an interview that after a strange lapse of 500 years, China is now assuming its rightful role as the predominant power of the world. So this is definitely a Chinese aspiration. And I have the feeling that that Biden is trying to walk a tightrope here with a very careful handling of a very precarious situation, which is, of course, potentially very dangerous, as you have an enormous military arsenal over the whole Pacific, in the South China Sea, American military presence, Chinese military buildup, and very closely looking at each other, yeah? And of course there's a danger that something might happen which then ignites an escalation that can be stopped, yeah? So I think this attempt of the Biden administration to handle that very tentatively and very carefully is probably the right way to do it at the moment.
I don't think that they have it calibrated all that well. And I guess there are many, many things to say about this. First, just as a starting point, I don't view China as a threat to the world. And I don't view China as a aspirant or even remotely capable or desirous of being the next unipolar power of the world or the next hegemon. I think we're completely in a different age where such an idea is unimaginable anyway. Substantively, China has a per capita income that is in international dollars, so-called, or purchasing adjusted dollars, about 1/3 of our per capita income. It's still a developing country. It's got a lot of people. It's got 1.4 billion people, but it is a developing country. They have the aspiration to become a developed country. That's going to take another 30 years of investment and hard work and economics and development of technologies and so on. And they are extraordinarily vulnerable, like all of us, to climate change. And so the agenda of energy transformation is very real for China for their own domestic purposes, not because of pressure, but because we're all in trouble together. This year they had one of the biggest droughts in their modern history, and it had huge consequences for the economy and society, especially in central China. And so they have a lot of hard work to do. In the meantime, it's quite interesting. The birth rate is so low, as you know, that the population has peaked, and it will decline significantly in the next 80 years. And the UN projects that by the end of this century, of course, on current demographic trends, the population will be around 800 million people, not 1.4 billion people.
Overtaken by India.
Oh, far overtaken by India, twice the size. And Africa as a whole, by the way, will be 5 times that. So China will have a median age by that point of about 57 years, which my wife doesn't like my generalization, but I don't believe old people want to take over the world, being one. I think old people like quiet, not global hegemony. And I mean it seriously. I see nothing in China's behavior other than defensive and resentment at the US, at the encirclement of the South China Sea. We don't even deign to call it the South China Sea. Everything is now the Indo-Pacific, 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 which is a term I never heard for the first 50 years, but it's the way to say not China. So it becomes a very convenient way to constantly not say the word China. Obama wanted to make a trans-Pacific partnership that would not include China. Can you imagine having an Asian trade agreement where China is not a member and you parade that because we need to write the rules, not them? This is civilized grown-up behavior? Not in my mind. This is childish, actually. And it failed, of course. It's just not serious. Every country in Asia has China as its main trading partner. And why not? So China's military budget, vastly smaller than the United States. Its nuclear arsenal, vastly smaller than the United States. If we actually treated China with respect, with deference, with a one China policy, without meddling, without trying to form AUKUS, a new military alliance of the United States, Australia, and the UK to make nuclear submarine bases in Australia, if we just behaved normally, we could actually have a normal relationship. If we didn't fly to Taipei to provoke over the strenuous objections of the Chinese government in the months leading up to their 20th Party Congress. I mean, what are we doing? I know what we're doing. We're playing American games. So in this sense, take Biden's attitude on this, by the way. He said, because he's not a crazy man at all, he said, that's a bad idea, this trip. But then Pelosi said, but I'm going to go. And Biden said, okay. And he said, I can't control the behavior of an equal part of our government, co-equal branch of our government, the Speaker of the House. I'm president, executive branch. But I called the White House, actually, they hated it. I said, you know, if she wants to go, let her go fly commercial. You're the commander, I mean, the president is the commander-in-chief, and she should not fly military escort to Taipei. He could have stopped the trip in a moment, but he chose not to. So that's the calibration. He's publicly against, the trip takes place anyway. Every day there are new sanctions put on China. Every day there are new limits on exports of technology. Every day the language, by the way, hardens. It's not hidden anymore that the purpose is to constrain China's development now. That's explicit American policy. And a couple of days ago, WTO ruled against our unilateral trade measures, and the US trade representative said, we don't care what WTO says, because what's for our national security is for us to decide. So the United States is also breaking the WTO system. By the way, this is Europe, you know, Europe is going to be caught as a loser in this. But Europe's reaction is very strange. Let us in on the deal. If you're going to break WTO, at least let us in under the tent. That's what van der Leyen said. That's what Macron said. At least count Europe within your borders. Not this is wrong, this violates an international agreement. No, let's team up together against China. So don't get caught in the same trap. And here, at least, Chancellor Scholz went. That was good. He was roundly attacked for going. Again, European rhetoric is increasingly anti-China to follow the US line. And you're not a member of NATO, and I think that is one of your great strengths, but the NATO members went along with the United States at this year's NATO meeting and think of this, to invite 4 Asian leaders to the NATO meeting. The leaders of Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. What is NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What are 4 Asian leaders doing in NATO? What is Mr. Stoltenberg doing saying that NATO must direct its mission to China. This is worse than mission creep. This is the path to war. So I would regard this, everybody wants to make a comparison to 1938. I don't buy it for a moment. I would make the comparison to 1912, say. We're on a path to the World War I type of war. The distrust, the blocks, the alliances, that's the path that we're on right now.
You have made this excursion into American domestic politics. I mean, the discussion between
Yep.
Pelosi and Biden, which brings me to the question, there is always, and it's also the case in Europe, there's always a domestic political component to foreign policy decisions.
Huge.
Huge, yes. You see it now in the reaction to the WTO situation. What I wanted to ask, foreign policy used to be a bipartisan domain and usually based on a bipartisan consensus. Is that still there? Is there still a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy decisions, or is there something sweltering in the underneath the carpet?
There is at the political level, there is definitely a bipartisan consensus that China is the enemy. So this will not change or be affected by any U.S. political shifts, because China has the effrontery to be successful and independent of the United States. And this is not allowed in the game of risk. So China is clearly the enemy, and it's clearly bipartisan. And the American people are fed a lot of hate rhetoric, and two rhetorics. One, China took all your jobs, and China's a threat to the world. So both of those are at play. And I would say Biden faces no obstacles on China policy except being too soft. So he's constantly watching his back, that he's not perceived as too soft. That's, of course, why he didn't stop Pelosi's trip, not because she was the co-equal part of government. Our Constitution assigns foreign policy explicitly to the President of the United States. He's also the commander-in-chief. This is not even a close call. Had he told her no, again, maybe she could have flown commercial, but she wasn't going to go. So he doesn't want to look soft. And that's the biggest danger in American politics, which is when you don't want to look soft, you end up in Vietnam, or you end up in countless other similar wars. When it comes to Ukraine, it is a much trickier situation. There is no groundswell of public sentiment to support the war in Ukraine. The American people, on the latest poll that I saw, which was early December, a poll of the polling group called Morning Consult, showed the country split exactly down the middle. Should we do more or should we do less for Ukraine? It was 47-47, really quite remarkable, right down the middle. The Republicans much less interested in this war than the Democrats, in part because the Democrats are backing the president, the Democratic president, and in part because while we have neoconservatives in both the Republican and the Democratic side, the neoconservatives have taken over the Democratic Party much more than the Republican Party, because Trump was just crazy, not neoconservative though. just a little nuts and unstable, but not a neocon. It's actually, he's a very dangerous personality and a very dangerous psychology, really, in my view, a clinical case that's quite serious, and why we had an attempted insurrection. But he didn't launch any wars. He's the only one in our modern history that didn't launch wars. Everyone else made wars. I'm sorry?
And no regime change. And no regime change.
Yeah, and no regime change. No, he liked the guy in North Korea. It's really interesting. Weird.
Too busy.
So all of this is to say that when you look at the Ukraine issue, the country's absolutely, this is not driven from below. This is driven from above. And that's partly why we could do something different if there were a different kind of leadership. Biden is not cornered in this. He's choosing this. It's interesting, pay attention to Victoria Nuland. She was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs in the Maidan. She flew repeatedly to Kiev to help orchestrate the Maidan. Now she is the Undersecretary of State for political affairs. It's the same mission that's gone on now for the past 8 years. So this is the team that wants that on the Ukrainian side. It's not driven from below. I thought when we voted the first huge amount for Ukraine, 60 billion the first time, 40, 60, I don't remember. It went fast. I said that's the last one of those that we'll vote for because the American people don't want that. But it's not right. So I'm often very wrong. We're about to vote another 40 billion, but not debated at all. There will be no debate on it at all because it will be a line item in an omnibus bill that will be voted at the end of the month. And the only debate will be, do we close government or not close government? And since the government will remain open, the 40 billion will go to Ukraine. There will have been not 1 hour of debate on this in the United States for $40 billion. That's how big we are, by the way, how wasteful, how potentially destructive, how careless. Because we wasted $7 trillion in Iraq and Syria. If you add up all of these disastrous wars, and it has weakened our society, and it added a lot of debt, so it has its consequences. But America's a large economy, and it can make a lot of stupid choices for a long, long, long time. And so this 40 billion will go. But now I'm going to predict not another one will go. Because sometime there's going to have to be a vote on this issue. And if there's ever a vote on this issue, it will not be supported by the American people, actually. They don't want to keep throwing tens of billions of dollars, even though it's a big economy. They don't actually want that. So this is the little bit of the domestic side. The anti-China stuff, I don't see that turning off. The only way to turn that off is for Europe to say clearly, don't get us into a war, to say that to the US. Could someone in Europe say that clearly to the United States? The answer seems to be no. But because Brussels doesn't want to have any foreign policy other than what the US wants right now. And Scholz doesn't want to have any foreign policy independent. And the Greens are more militaristic than the neocons. I've never... Mrs. Baerbock is absolutely the most militaristic senior official in the West. It's amazing to me. And by the way, so destructive of the German economy. I can't even imagine, but maybe that's the Greens' idea. They always wanted deindustrialization. They're going to get it. I don't understand it, but that is, for me, the strange question of German politics, is this is completely against Germany's interests.
Jeffrey, one last question before we open to the floor, because I see there's already a lot of interest in getting involved in the discussion. How do you see this recent initiative now, the invitation of all the African leaders to Washington for a big summit meeting with Africa? Is this window dressing, or is there some substance to it?
Yes, this is all about China, believe me.
It's about China, yes.
It's nice that they're doing it. We had an active foreign aid program in the United States. Of course, it started in 1947. The U.S. virtually invented foreign assistance, first for Greece and Turkey, and then the Marshall Plan. And when I was a young person, I thought how wonderful and how generous, because the U.S. still talked about foreign assistance, and President Kennedy, who I remember, talked about the Alliance for Progress and so forth. The collapse of foreign assistance came, the utter collapse. There was a long decline measuring foreign assistance as a share of GDP, but then it went like this, gradual decline, boom. What year was that? 92. Soviet Union closed down, we're done with the world. We don't care. Who cares about the world? Now we don't have to compete with the Soviet Union for hearts and minds anywhere. So the lowest level of foreign assistance was the Clinton administration. Shocking to me. That was supposedly my government. I'm a Democrat. I've been a voter for the Democrats all my life. So nothing. Then, interestingly, came the George W. Bush administration, which I said at the time very naively, this is the worst government we'll ever have. No, I didn't say that. I said this is the worst government we've ever had. I didn't know we would keep making new records like global warming. But in any event, Bush actually raised spending. I was the person, literally, who recommended the program to fight AIDS and the program to fight malaria. And when I recommended it, by the way, to the White House, because I couldn't stand that White House because of the Iraq War, I pushed them to have an anti-malaria program, which was called the President's Malaria Initiative, PMI. And I said to one of our leaders, I'm telling you how good this is, but you guys don't deserve it. But anyway, you should do it, even though I don't even like you doing it. It's really important to do. And they launched it, and malaria deaths came down by several 100,000 a year over the next 10 years. But the reason I'm telling you this is the following. In 2009, President Obama came to office, and I was invited to dinner at the White House, one of the first dinners, with a group of economists. And we went around the table, and one talked about housing, this one talked about that. I talked about foreign aid and how now we could do something quite wonderful. And he shut me down. We don't have the votes, we're no interest. And there was no interest. And there was no attempt to do anything new during those years. Then Trump came, and Trump, his only mantra every year was no foreign aid. Make America great again, America first, no foreign aid. Now we have a meeting with the Africans. Why? Because we need cobalt. for batteries. And there's a second reason. We need cobalt.
Sold it to the Chinese?
Yeah. During the 20 years of complete American uninterest in Africa, China got 80% of the DRC cobalt. And the way they did it, by the way, was quite straightforward. Kabila gave it to them, and they gave a kickback. And so it was a very convenient arrangement. The United States, no interest, and now they're interested. There may be other reasons as well, but the basic reason for this meeting is China. I don't want to be too cynical, but I'm sorry, I'm just trying to be accurate because you asked me a question. Now, can this lead to something useful? Absolutely, yes. Because if China's giving assistance, now the United States has to do something. Interestingly, the one thing they will announce is an idea that I promoted 2 years ago and really was the main promoter of it, to make Africa the 21st member of the G20, so it would become the G21. And I said that because the European Union is the 20th member of the G20. There are only 19 countries in the G20, plus the European Union as a chair. So I said if the European Union has a chair, we should have the African Union as a chair, because that's 1.4 billion people, $3 trillion economy. Apparently, President Biden's going to announce this week. This is a campaign that I've been on. They didn't ask me. I'm not telling them. They're not talking to me anyway. But I think this is a good thing, and I strongly support it. But it's not a burst of interest, of deep concern about development. I'll tell you, because you mentioned the diplomacy of the Sustainable Development Goals, that's my job. I'm sorry to be so blunt, and I hope it doesn't get me into too much more trouble. But just to explain the lay of the land, the United States does not speak about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's one of the only countries in the world that does not. The reason is the US Treasury does not want Sustainable Development Goals mentioned in any US policy because it could put pressure on the US budget. So it's actually a matter of policy that the US doesn't speak about the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 5 countries in the world out of the 193 UN members that have not had a voluntary national review of the SDGs. They are, I don't think I have them exactly right, Yemen, South Sudan, Haiti,
North Korea?
no, Somalia, and the United States. I think that's the list.
The company you keep.
Exactly. So this is our Sustainable Development Goal agenda. It shows the deep, profound, and persistent interest in helping to alleviate poverty in the world. No.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the floor is yours, and we will have a microphone.